So hi everybody, welcome to the stream where today, of course, we're going to go through the Chapter Approved 2022 rules that have now been revealed. So if you're not familiar, at the weekend there was the US Open, and at the US Open they trialed the two new missions from Chapter Approved 2022. Now what this also means, of course, is that we have also had some insight into what the new secondary missions are going to be, and these were very kindly previewed in detail by Goonhammer, the link to which should be in the description. And what we're going to start off doing then is looking at the missions, of course, that were previewed for the weekend. These can be found on the Warhammer community website mission. So the first mission that they played on the day was Secure Missing Artifacts. Now, if we have a look at the map, you'll see that actually it looks very similar. That's because this is priority targets with some changes. Okay, so starting next year, the missions will be largely similar, which is good news, right? You don't want it to be too different. You don't want it to put people off. They will be similar in most ways. However, there are some big differences. So the primary has now been split in Warhammer 40,000, or I should say next year the primary will be split. So it is no longer the case that you will score 5 and then score 10 and then score 15 for the primary. The primary will now score you 4, 8 or 12, where you would score 5, 10 or 15, and now there is a second part of the primary which changes for each mission. The way you score the 4, 8 and 12, as you would do the 5, 10 and 15, is basically the same. So in these missions you can see we still have Control 1, Control 2, Control More, which is the same as what Priority Targets is now. Likewise, the second mission is also a Hold 1, Hold 2, Hold More. However, I have been told that apparently the Hold 2, Hold 3, Hold Mores are still going to be in the game, so that's still something you're going to have to prepare for, and that is something that a lot of armies do struggle with, so that's sticking around. It's largely the same, but it's good news that we're not going to have to change too much of how we play in this respect. However, this is where things get spicy. So we now have a second part of the primary, right? So this one here is called Precious Artifacts, and this is how you get those remaining 3 points. Both of these missions have 3 points assigned to this. I'm going to assume that this is the same for all missions. That would make sense. Now, this concerns me a bit, and the reason this concerns me, as you'll see in a few minutes when we look at the other mission, is because these two parts of the primary are wildly different. Now, the reason that's potentially dangerous is because that can often mean that some armies simply really struggle on certain missions. You'll notice on the next mission that you get points for killing units. Now, what that means is that if you play against knights, well, unsurprisingly, you're not going to be killing 3 units a turn. If you are, things have gone really bad for the Knights player. So that means that all of a sudden, you play against Knights, you won't score that very well. And that's just an example. I will say I don't hate that part of the primary, but that is an example of where, at the moment, I'm a little bit worried, and I am anxious to see the rest of these missions, because if they continue to be different, each mission, drastically, this could ultimately mean that we end up having a rock, paper, scissors situation in tournaments where all of a sudden, oh, it's this mission, okay, so this player's got a 15-point lead on me. And that's not that fun. I don't really like that. So that has made me a little bit nervous. Overall, I think these changes are interesting. So there are some really good changes about these primary missions. So if we look at this mission here, the big change that we've got when it comes to priority targets is that your opponent actually picks what the priority target is. So you're still going to have the 2 missions in your player A territory, but your opponent is going to choose which of those 2 objectives is the precious artifact, and that is going to be the objective that you need to hold on to every turn in order to get those 3 points. So this is interesting, and this is good because, of course, what your opponent is likely to do, your opponent is more likely to choose the more northern objective, according to this map, northeast, southwest, that you get that on these maps, right? And the reason they're going to do that is to force you to come out a little bit more. And the other mission we're going to look at today also has this, where there are parts to the mission that encourage you to be that little bit more aggressive, and that's generally good because when it comes to designing the game, you want to encourage armies to interact with each other. You don't want it to be like the old priority targets, really, where with the old priority targets, because of that secondary mission, you could pretty much sit in your backfield and maybe just continually contest the middle objective, and you wouldn't really interact with your opponent much, and you can still win the game. So it's an interesting dynamic as to how much you want to force players to interact with each other. That's the first mission that we're going to look at. The second one that they played is this one here, and it's called Recover the Relics. Now, Recover the Relics is actually, again, it is the case that this mission is based off one that we saw in Chapter Approved 2021 and 2020, because they remain the same, of course. But there have been some differences that are going to force you to play a bit more aggressively when it comes to this mission. So in this mission, again, if we look at the 2021 pack, you could just take like Raise the Banners and just continually hold your back 3 objectives, and you could get some really high points if you took the right secondaries without really engaging your opponent. However, if we look at this mission has a mission-specific rule which says that you will only get the CP that you need at the start of each turn, and it's pretty vital to the economy of players, if you control objectives that are in the middle of the board. And you can actually get a second command point if you hold the objective in your opponent's deployment zone. The second part I don't dislike, because it encourages you to play offensively. However, when it comes to designing games, and this is the thing actually for board games generally, a friend of mine was talking to me about this, well, when you design board games, it's important to design them in such a way that players that aren't doing well have the opportunity to come back into the game. And so Games Workshop should be careful when they're designing games like this. Because if they put things like this in the game, which reward you for dominating the battlefield, what that means is that if you're on the back foot, you're just going to get hampered. Because not only have you had a bad turn, but now your opponent's also got more CP. So this actually could work to the detriment of the game in the long run. This is a small example, but it's just something I thought I would raise because it's a good example of something that we don't want to move towards when it comes to designing missions for Warhammer 40,000. Again, this is a hold 1, hold 2 mission. We like that, that's all good. Against this maximum of 12, so it's 4, 8, 12 instead of 5, 10, 15. So again, pretty straightforward. However, the second part of the primary, I don't know what to call it. I think everybody is kind of waiting for Games Workshop to give this a term at this point. Some people call it the tertiary, the primary mission Mark II. Whatever you want to call it is fine by me. However, the second part of it is what I was talking about before, which is a kill more mission. And I have a mixed relationship when it comes to kill more secondaries and primaries. I'll go through that more when we talk about the secondaries, but overall I will say I don't think this is a terrible primary mission, because generally speaking this will be achievable for most armies. Only when you're playing against things like Custodes, Knights, is going to be very, very difficult, and those armies aren't going to have that advantage. However, overall I think this is a pretty good secondary and pretty achievable most of the time. And again, it's a good secondary and it's a good secondary part of the primary. I'm going to keep mixing that up, guys, I'm sorry, but it's a good secondary part of the primary because it encourages you to interact with your opponent and actually kill stuff, which is good. Okay, so on to the secondaries. And as I say, these are taken from the Goonhammer website. So thank you very much for Goonhammer for putting these together in an easy form that we can use here. And the link to the Goonhammer article should be in the description. So let's talk about the secondaries that are different, and do the changes that they've made to them help the game, and what armies they're going to disadvantage, I think is the particularly interesting one. I am going to say now that when I talk about these secondary missions, I'm going to do so without talking too much about the current meta. Okay, because if we talk, for example, about Paul the Witch, and we talk about it in the context of Grey Knights, I know that Grey Knights are very, very good now, and it's very nice to go against Grey Knights at the moment and have those 15 points. However, the reign of Grey Knights won't last forever. This is going to last for a whole year, and if Grey Knights get nerfed, we need to look at these missions in the context of, are these good missions, not are they punishing what we want to punish right now, if that makes sense. So Stranglehold remains the same. Nothing wrong with that, no problem. You still need to get that stacking with Oath of Moment. I'm assuming Direct Assault is also going to change, but it's pretty good, and you'll notice that there's actually another mission we're going to see today which also plays around the center. So Stranglehold stacking is still going to be a thing. It's a great secondary. I'm pretty certain it's going to be a very popular choice into next year. Behind Enemy Lines has stayed the same. Engage Nil Fronts though has changed. Engage Nil Fronts is probably one of the most popular secondaries of the game, and the reason for that is because, as I say, it doesn't require you to interact much at all with your opponent. Now, The big change to the secondary is that in order to count towards engaged in all fronts, you can't just do it with action monkeys anymore. You need to do it with a vehicle or monster or unit with 3 or more models. Notably, it doesn't exclude characters though. Okay, so things like Celestine and stuff can actually score this secondary. I have mixed reviews when it comes to the disabling of the importance of action monkeys. The reason I say I have a mixed opinion here is because I really liked that some units in the game got given a purpose. I loved that lictors had this fantastic use in the game. They were auto takes in the Tyranid list for a long time because they were fantastic at actually getting you points, and it was very, very thematic. I loved it. I thought it was absolutely great to see them on the table because you never ever used to see things like lictors. However, at the same time, I was seeing mostly things like Crusader squads and things like Crypto Thralls being used where they shouldn't. But overall, I don't necessarily mind that. I will say this is very good for some factions, and as we continue to look through these lists, you'll see that as a Gene Cult player, I'm pretty happy. Pretty happy because even though things are a bit worse for me, I would say overall things are worse for other players. But I guess we'll see how things play out. To the last has remained the same. Grind them down, yeah, has still remained the same. Again, yeah, pretty good setting. I don't think that needed any changes. And then no prisoners has changed. Now, there are 2 very, very big changes here. I don't know if this is a typo. It's been up for a few days and Goonhammer haven't changed it, so I'm assuming this is the way it is going to be played. But the first big change is that it does no longer say non-monster. That's a big deal because this is, if this is as this will be played, this is such a blow to Tyranids. I would be very disappointed on behalf of Tyranid players because this is just 15 points that you'll get, because you'll easily get all those wounds if you're taking monsters, if you're taking horde. Those are your only 2 options if you're a Tyranid player. You can't just go into vehicles. So it's going to be very, very difficult. I guess you can take big character monsters. Maybe that's how they'll get around it. I don't know. Overall, though, the other change is that you will get 1 extra victory point at 50 and at 100, which is great. And I think that that's cool because I think that too often no prisoners for me was sitting at like 12 points. It might have been how people were tweaking their lists, but I think generally speaking this will buff this secondary more into prominence. I'm just a bit worried about how it's going to affect Pawn Nids players. When I talk about how I don't want to think too much about the codexes now and in the future, I think just more generally it's good to talk about these things, that it's not good to play against factions and go, cool, you play X, so I get 15 points. That's not good. I don't think that's good for the game at all. So let's move on then. So yeah, in terms of the kill secondaries, Assassination and Titan Slayer remain the same. They were pretty good. Assassination, I think, needs to be changed. The reason I think Assassination needs to be changed is because I play GSC and I'm biased in this respect. I also think that generally speaking, it is most of the time not relevant to the game, all right, in all seriousness. The reason for that is because most of the time your players don't have 5 characters, and even if you have 5 characters, it's very easy to keep 2 of those live. So it's not very hard to stop your opponent scoring high on this secondary. Titan Slayer, again, okay, so this is why I don't like kill secondaries. I don't say I don't like them, but I'm not a massive fan of them. So to explain why I'm not a massive fan of them, I'm going to take you back in time and we're going to talk about ITC. So the way ITC worked was that the competitive tournaments generally used the ITC missions back in 8th edition. And when it started, there was a load of kill secondaries. There were things like Bring It Down and Assassinate, I believe, was a mission that you could choose in those matchups. And what happened was people complained to the ITC guys and they went, look, I play guard and my opponent can always take Bring It Down against me. They just get all these points against me. It doesn't seem particularly fair, right? And I think that that's completely valid because, like, if you're a narrative guard player, that means that you then just give up all these points. And I don't think that's right. And so what ITC did, which interestingly GW haven't done, is ITC went, okay, and they went back and they came out with another pack and another pack. And each pack that came out had more missions that you could take to get kill points, right? To get points for killing stuff. And it eventually got to the point that basically every faction in the game gave up one of these missions, which was fine. But then you kind of take a step back and you go, why don't you just have one? Why don't you just have one mission that just gives you points for the percentage of the army that you kill or whatever? Now, as I was talking about before when we were talking about the primary, it's good to have missions that encourage interaction, but when it's just kind of like randomly dispersed amongst the factions, it's just punishing certain factions, and that's not good. We don't want that. Now, as I say, that's the way ITC went. Games Workshop haven't even gone that way. They've still kept this narrow selection of missions that punish armies, again, just seemingly at random, and they just don't need it. It's like, why do hordes need to be punished? Why, if you're a guard player who takes lots of tanks, you need to be punished? It's just not necessary. That's why I'm not that keen on them. Like I said, I won't say I hate them or anything, but yeah, I have some reservations when it comes to these. Anyway, moving on. So Bring It Down. When it comes to Bring It Down, it has changed. So now the threshold for getting 2 points per vehicle or monster is 10 wounds. This is actually a pretty impactful change. There are a lot of things in the game at 10 wounds. Raiders are 10 wounds, Chimeras are 10 wounds, Rhinos, GSC trucks. These things all being worth 2 points now. It's a pretty big deal and will change the game and will make this a much more viable secondary than it was before, because a lot of the time people could take lots and lots of these types of vehicles and they just wouldn't really give up the points for it to be worth taking. So then we're going to go on to the shadow operations. These probably had the greatest changes. So Raise the Banners has remained the same. Deploy teleport homers, however, that has now changed. So this is an interesting change. So now it completes in one turn if you are a troops option. Now this is particularly big for things like Genestealer cults, Death Watch. You'll notice that bikers now do teleport homers super easily, and they can also do retrieve enactment data, which is fantastic. We've collected all the Octarius data, apparently, so now we're on to enactment. But yeah, overall it's a good buff for them. This is going to hurt certain factions. The more elite factions are going to struggle much more here. I'm not a massive fan, I will say. Moving on to RND, I don't know what we're going to call this, probably just retrieve data. When we look at retrieve data, I'm not a massive fan of the dice roll being a particularly important component of that. I like dice in Warhammer 40k. However, I don't like games being decided by one dice too often. And that is what this is going to increase in the game, especially as you get later into the game and you have like one model left and you're going to give it a go. And if you get that one, you'll win the game. If you don't, you'll lose. However, I get what Games Workshop are trying to do here, and I can appreciate it. It's interesting that it's still capped at 12, even though they made it harder to score. This was an interesting secondary in 2021 because Rod was one of the most popular secondaries in the game. However, it wasn't that popular with top players, and the reason for that was because you could only get 12, and if you want to win a tournament, generally speaking, you need a bunch of hundreds. And so it's got an interesting place in the meta, I think. However, I think, yeah, generally speaking, most people are going to play it much less. However, again, as a Genestealer cult player, because you -1 from the roll if you're a troops option, I'm very happy about this change. This is worse for me, but it's much, much worse for everybody else. And so that is, generally speaking, good. And then we have Investigate Signal. Now, this is interesting. I'm interested to hear what people's thoughts are on it now. The reason I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on it is because, on the one hand, it is a bit easier to do because of the fact that you can do it even if your opponent is near the center of the battlefield, which is great at the start of the turn, and you then just have to wipe them. However, it does also stack with Stranglehold. And that is interesting because Stranglehold is still going to be really good, and so you can still take Stranglehold, investigate sites, and maybe it will be the case that this is a common combo that we'll see so that people can stack those secondaries. I spoke with Maxine about how you can stack secondaries quite effectively and get a lot of points, and it's very, very popular with a lot of the top players. So I'll be interested to see what people think about that. And then finally, we have Warcraft, and there's only one change that we have in Warcraft, which is that Psychic Interrogation no longer requires line of sight. And this is undoubtedly a very good change because of the fact that you just never saw the psychic secondaries really much before. So hopefully this gives it a bit more play. Not having to put your character in the open means that you can maybe reliably score it over the course of the game. I still don't think you're going to see this a lot of the time. However, it is a much more plausible backup in the right matchups. So overall, yeah, a good change to the secondary, and I'm glad that we've seen that. And that is it, guys. So thank you very much for watching this video or stream. I hope it was really useful, and I'll see you guys for the next one.